supervise the functioning of the judicial branch in Ecuador. So, traditional separation of powers theories assume that governments will not be tyrants and that despotism will be controlled if you divide the branches of government, right? And these divided branches of government are supposed to check on one another, and they are supposed to, denounce what is going on in the other branches. But the reality is that modern governments actually function in a way in which all these branches of power, and when I say all, of course you're thinking of three, but I will explain that, for instance, in my country we have five. I'll tell you why later on. But all these branches of power act in sort of a complicity, and they are not completely independent. And this is a big problem, especially when it comes to the judiciary, which is supposed to be independent. But in many countries, in most countries in the world, actually, the executive branch is overwhelming into the other branches of power, and particularly in the judiciary. So the judiciary is not really independent. So think for a minute, for instance, in how right now the US is going through this selection process to elect a judge for the Supreme Court, right? Which basically depends on, the political tensions and the political balance. And how can you ensure that a guy like Kavanaugh will be independent once he's sitting at the court, right? Of course, the idea of judicial independence is a very old idea. And the functioning of a democracy requires that actually the judiciary is independent when taking its decisions. When the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was inaugurated on September 5th, 1979, the president of the court at the time, Judge Carlos Roberto Reina, said this beautiful phrase, which in theory is, of course, true, but in practical terms, has never been truth in our region in general, in Latin America in general, and maybe is not true in any region of the world. What exactly judicial independence entails according to the standards that have been developed for our region by the Inter-American system, and concretely by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights? That the judges have an appointment procedure that is adequate and does not imply political influence in the appointment of judges, that they have a fixed term in office, and that they will be protected against external pressures. This is what judicial independence entails. But in our region, and I will talk specifically of those countries that were Spanish colonies in Latin America, we have had a very bad tradition of not ensuring judicial independence. This starts with the Spanish crown and a selective, if you wish, judicial system that would only ensure justice for the people who were colonizing these territories, but for the indigenous people who were actually the owners of the land, they decided to set up a different judicial system. It goes on to a process where becoming a citizen would imply having properties, either real estate or investments. And if you didn't have those, you would not be a citizen, and then you would not have access to the judicial system. Then it comes to trying to copy, once our nations were independent from the Spanish crown, trying to copy good ideas from different countries, especially from Spain and other European countries, but that were not necessarily successful in ensuring judicial independence. And this was accompanied by an idea of using the judicial system to repress. Then we moved to models of conditioned justice and elitist justice, and only a few could access justice because in order to make sure that you will win a case, basically you needed either economical power or social power to be successful in order to pressure judges. At some point, Latin American countries realized that they had to ensure universal access to justice. But the way in which, the fashion in which these countries decided to ensure this universal access to justice was through paternalistic politics regarding judicial protection. And this populist approach was not successful either because the judiciary was not independent. The judiciary took the decisions upon request of other power branches that were actually trying to push a populist agenda and a paternalist agenda regarding the protection of rights, or so-called protection of rights. And the current situation, I will describe this further on later in my presentation, is that in many Latin American countries, justice has owners. So certain groups of society have decided that they are the ones who are going to manage the appointment of judges. They will decide what the terms of judges in office will be. They will decide how the judges will decide the cases. And this is basically a problem for the maintenance of democracy, because if you want to have a democracy, you need an independent judiciary. So we don't have real democracies, in fact. I will briefly address the situation specifically in my country. This picture was taken on October 5th, 1984. At the time, the president of Ecuador was Mr. León Febres Cordero. The legislature appointed a new Supreme Court, and this was through a process that allegedly included a discussion with civil society organizations and allegedly implied the possibility of questioning the candidates and avoiding appointing candidates who were not going to be independent once in office. But he didn't like that court. So he ordered the police to surround the premises of the Palacio de Justicia, of the Supreme Court, in order to avoid the new judges taking office. And this demonstration of the imposition of the will of the executive branch on the judicial branch is not only symbolic. In practice, this implies that the executive branch is going to decide what the court should do, which cases will hear, and how the cases will be decided. Although the problems for the judicial independence in Ecuador started much earlier than 1984, since then, we have never been able to ensure an independent judiciary in Ecuador, since then. And recently, when we had this transitional process that started in February, we thought that it was finally the time had come for an independent judiciary, but we were mistaken. Since the 90s in Ecuador, several international organizations, several academic institutions have been observing the lack of judicial independence as a big problem for democracy and have been proposing solutions for the lack of judicial independence in Ecuador. The first effort in this sense was the report issued by the Florida International University in 1990 under the auspices of USAID. Other domestic studies and proposals carried out by domestic NGOs on the same sense also push forward the idea of the need for an independent judiciary. In most instances, these studies were carried out through donations made by the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations, among other institutions. Finally, in 1997, we arrived to a model that was supposed to ensure that the new appointed judges for the Supreme Court would be independent. This is the co-optation system that implied that the judges would be elected. At the time, we had 31 judges sitting at the Supreme Court, which is a lot for a Supreme Court of a very small country. So the judges would come from the academy, 10 of them. Others will come from the judicial sector, being judicial servants, career judicial servants, 10 of them. And 10 would come from practicing attorneys. And the system allegedly was bulletproof. But in reality, political parties managed to once again influence these three sectors of society, the academy, the judicial servants, and the practicing attorneys, in order to once again insert in the court people who was fond of their ideas and who was very close to their leaders. So once again, we didn't have an independent court. And finally, in 2011, President Correa, who ruled the country for over 10 years, under the argument that we never had an independent judiciary, decided to call for a referendum that among other things, asked the population if they wanted to change radically the judiciary in Ecuador, and in order to do so, if they would authorize him to appoint a council of the judiciary formed only by his appointees that would basically, there's no translation for this phrase to English, I believe. Yeah. Would basically, do things anything necessary in order to ensure that in the future, the judiciary would be independent. Anything necessary, meaning not ensuring judicial independence, right? So we call that moment of the Ecuadorian recent history the metida de manos en la justicia, meaning that they put their hands on the judicial system. In order to ensure future independence, they decided to dismantle the judicial branch. After that happened, in Ecuador, a very interesting phenomena started occurring, which is that both national and international organizations and civil society started pressuring the government in order to ensure that the judiciary was going to be independent. And once we realized that the judiciary was not independent, civil society, both national and international, started denouncing the lack of independence of the judiciary in Ecuador. It all started with an oversight of the judicial system that was actually requested by the Council of the Judiciary, appointed through this referendum in 2011. The oversight was supposed to say that now, after the referendum and after the authorization to the president to change the judicial system had become independent. But the conclusions of the report that was issued by several international experts headed by Baltasar Garzón, a Spanish former judge and practicing attorney right now. The conclusions of the report basically stated that after the referendum and after the actions executed as a consequence of the referendum, the judiciary in Ecuador was even less independent than before. That was the conclusion. So they were expecting, and then they even paid, they made a huge investment in order to have this study done. And they were expecting that the study would say, well, now the judiciary is finally independent. But the conclusions say exactly the opposite. Right after that, a case was submitted in 2013 to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, a case decided in 2014, which is the Quintana Coello et alia case, a case concerning political decisions taken in 2004 in order to send home all the justices of the Supreme Court in Ecuador. This was during the government of Lucio Gutiérrez. Actually, this case was litigated by the Center for Human Rights at the Catholic University of Ecuador, where David was working at the time. And it set a very interesting standard on what exactly judicial independence should be in Latin America. After that, Human Rights Watch and the Due Process of Law Foundation, an NGO based in Washington, issued reports on judicial independence in Ecuador, denouncing how the judiciary had become tainted and was not independent at all after the 2011 referendum. And in order to demonstrate that, they used specific cases to show how instructions were issued through the executive branch in order to decide cases, how judges were being subjected to disciplinary proceedings in order to have their mandates terminated, and replace them with judges who would decide according to the executive branch wishes, how some people had been politically persecuted through the judicial system, which became a repressive instrument in Ecuador, and proposed several ways out, several ideas in order to make sure that in the future the system was not going to be used like this. In 2017, after none of the recommendations of the 2014 DPLF report were complied with, DPLF issued a new report, now addressing how the Supreme Court of Ecuador, the national court we call it, was renovated, and how the new judges were even less independent than the previous judges that were appointed in 2012. From 2016 until 2018, there was growing internal criticism and confrontation regarding the lack of judicial independence. Practicing attorneys were denouncing all the time. And although we were using the system, we were sure that the system was not functioning. And that, for instance, if you presented a constitutional challenge to a given law or to a given decision of the executive branch, for sure you would lose. But still, we wanted to use the system in order to demonstrate that the judiciary was not independent. In 2017, we had a change of government. What happened was really odd, because the guy who's currently our president, Mr. Lenin Moreno, was the vice president of President Correa during his first mandate. So we were all sure, at least I was sure, I guess David was sure as well, that this was only the continuation of the same ideas and the same political agenda and the same lack of judicial independence. But at the end of the day, Moreno decided to turn his back on Correa, to the point that his vice president, who was Correa's vice president during his second mandate, is now in jail. He ended up in jail for corruption, and he was prosecuted basically with the acquiescence of our current president. In February of this year, on February 4th, we had a referendum. In the referendum, the population was asked if they wanted to replace the Citizens Participation Council. So now I will explain why we have 5 branches of power. In our constitutional design, under the Constitution of 2008, we included 2 additional branches of power. So besides the traditional branches of power, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, we also have the Citizens Participation and Social Control branch, which is in charge of basically supervising what several authorities in Ecuador are doing and appointing them: the General Prosecutor, the Solicitor General, the Ombudsman, the Council of the Judiciary, the Electoral Council, and so on. And we also have the Electoral Branch, which is in charge of calling for elections and referendums and so on, which is very frequent. That's probably the reason why Correa decided to add this 5th branch of power, the Electoral Branch, because he had so many electoral processes that he needed a specific machinery to carry out all these processes. So in the referendum, the population was asked if they would agree to terminating the mandates of the Citizens Participation Council, and in turn, having a transitory Citizens Participation Council review the mandates of the prosecutor, the General Controller, the Solicitor General, the Council of the Judiciary, the Electoral Council, in order to verify if they were complying with their constitutional duties and their legal duties, and if this transitional Citizens Participation Council concluded that these authorities were not complying with their mandates, they could terminate their mandates as well and appoint temporal authorities. And that's what has been going on since March in our country. Since March, most of the authorities appointed by this Citizens Participation branch have had their mandates terminated. Even other authorities, which are, according to our Constitution, completely autonomous, like the Constitutional Court, have had their mandates terminated by the transitional Citizens Participation Council, which of course brings this shadow of illegitimacy and doubt around the work of the transitional Citizens Participation Council. But part of it was evaluating the Council of the Judiciary, which is the highest judicial body in the country and is an administrative and supervisory organ of the judicial branch, which is supposed to appoint judges, evaluate judges, terminate the mandates of judges, and of course do all sort of administrative things like buildings and hiring IT people and etc. Last June, in the context of the compliance with the decision of the referendum, the Citizens Participation Council terminated the mandates of the Council of the Judiciary because they decided that the people at the Council of the Judiciary were not complying with their constitutional and legal duties. And they appointed 5 citizens in order to become the transitional Council of the Judiciary. Don't ask me why I was among those 5 citizens. I was very enthusiastic. This was really odd because a year and a half ago, I was the public enemy, right? I even left my country. I left my country because I was being threatened due to the cases that I was bringing to court and due to the complaints that I was bringing to the public opinion against the government of Mr. Correa. But all of a sudden, they needed a human rights defender. So, oddly enough, in this 5-member council, they appointed 3 members who are publicly known to belong to one of the main right-wing political parties in the country, the Partido Social Cristiano, Mr. Febres Cordero's party. Do you remember this image of the police surrounding the Supreme Court? Well, 3 sympathizers of this guy were appointed members of the Transitional Council of the Judiciary. And the 2 other members were Mrs. Angelica Porras, labor rights specialist who has been the historical advocate of the main trade unions in Ecuador, and me, the problematic guy. And we thought that we could manage to actually change the Ecuadorian culture of not respecting judicial independence. But it was impossible to do because, every time we had to vote on something, for instance, not suspending a judge for a decision that he or she had taken, we lost, right? 3 votes to 2. So we decided to go to the media and we started publicizing everything the council was doing and just showing the population that the 3 guys from the right-wing political party were trying to sabotage the idea of judicial independence. And it worked for a little while until on September 20th, the Citizens Participation Council decided that this was too much, that we were exposed to the media in a bad manner, and that we were not supposed to, discuss these issues outside of our closed room, and that we were supposed to be replaced by a permanent council of the judiciary that would be more obedient, which is a bad prediction for the future of the judiciary in Ecuador, right? I announced that I would address briefly some international standards that would be the ideal outline for what judicial independence should be in Latin America in general. And I would like to start with the basic principles on judicial independence of the United Nations, and specifically on Principle 2, that says that judges should decide cases only on the basis of the law and the facts, without any sort of pressure, restriction, influence, and so on and so forth. Of course, this is not true, not only in Ecuador, but in general in Latin America. I know here in the room we do have other Latin Americans, and you would agree with me that in general in Latin America we do not have these protections for the judges in order to avoid external pressures. But that's the main component of judicial independence, external independence. But you also have the components of internal independence, making sure that the judges will have a fixed term, making sure that the procedures for the appointment of judges, the election of judges, will be legal, and that their positions will be respected, and that they will not be removed from office unless they have committed a very grave breach of their duties, or in case their mandates have expired. The Inter-American system, through its case law, has developed very interesting standards on judicial independence that would be applicable for any Latin American country. Although, of course, in international law, you don't have the stare decisis principle, meaning that case law is not binding, it's not really binding. Still, the ideas developed by the Inter-American human rights system on judicial independence could be applicable anywhere in Latin America, at least. It starts with this requirement of independence for anybody that is going to decide on rights and obligations of people. Anybody, either judicial or administrative, that will decide on rights and obligations of persons is supposed to be independent. Furthermore, in ensuring independence, the decision bodies should be protected against restrictions in the exercise of their duties imposed by external bodies, by other branches of power, and even by higher courts, or in the case of my country and several countries throughout the world, impositions by administrative bodies that are in charge of evaluating, appointing, and terminating judges. Decision organs should also be protected against statements made by public authorities that could imply some sort of interference. This was very frequent in my country, in Ecuador. The cases were not decided in courtrooms. The cases were decided in this weekly program that the president had every Saturday from 10 to 2, where he issued instructions to both prosecutors and judges on how to decide very notorious cases. This happened also in other countries. For instance, in Venezuela, this has happened a lot as well during President Chavez's administration. You don't only have to ensure that judges are independent individually. You also have to ensure that the judiciary as an institution, as a whole, is independent. This to the role that the judiciary plays in a country that is supposed to be a democracy. So you have to make sure that the institutional dimension of judicial independence is also protected in a democracy. You also have to make sure that judicial independence exists in order to make sure that the population at large, in general, have the right to judicial guarantees. There's no due process if you don't have an independent judiciary. And if judges fear that their mandates will be terminated anytime due to the decisions that they are taking, of course, you do not have judicial independence, and hence you don't have due process for the population in general. Now, those standards are ideals, right? But what's the current situation of judicial independence in our region? Since I will be briefly addressing the question of judicial independence with regards to the special jurisdiction for peace in Colombia, and I have already addressed the situation of judicial independence with regards to the Ecuadorian judiciary, I decided to cut this chart that actually is part of the executive summary of the World Economic Forum of last year on judicial independence around the world, to show that of 137 countries examined in the World Economic Forum on judicial independence, Colombia occupies is in rank 111, and Ecuador is in position 135 out of 137 countries. And the situation for the rest of the region is not actually better. The first country of the region appearing in the ranking is Uruguay, which is in position 22. The United States is in position 25. Then you can find Brazil in position 59. So all the countries in our continent are actually in very bad shape in terms of judicial independence. That's the current situation. And how to make sure that the judiciary is kept at a distance from the political turmoil, it's very hard in practice to answer. There are several obstacles still for judicial independence in Latin America in general, and in particular in Ecuador and in Colombia. That starts with political tensions. For instance, any change of government would imply that the countries are being founded again, and all good ideas are just swept away, and you have to, take new political decisions on how to manage every branch, including the judicial branch. Colombia has gone through a recent change of government, for instance, and this has implied, specifically for the special jurisdiction for peace, that the current president has already announced that he will make changes to the special jurisdiction for peace, which was weak already, but might become even weaker, for instance, if a constitutional amendment is passed in order to avoid the special jurisdiction for peace and the disappeared search unit and the Truth Commission. If this constitutional amendment is passed, these institutions would not be able to get information from other public institutions, for instance, secret archives of the military. So that would weaken even more the already weak judicial independence of the special jurisdiction for peace, for instance. Then you have, of course, political interests. In the case of Ecuador, the reason why the possibility of having an independent judiciary has been sabotaged from the inside is because one of the political parties that is attempting to win the next presidential election, which will take place in a couple of years, is trying to use the judiciary in order to cut the competence. Basically, what they are trying to do is to prosecute several potential candidates on false allegations in order to avoid them running for office. So political interests might also compromise the independence of the judiciary. Economical interests. In several countries throughout the region, and in particular in those countries that survive due to the extractive industries, either oil or mining, big companies, transnational companies, have the power to influence the decisions of the judiciary in order to make sure that the citizens that are being affected, for instance, by contamination, or indigenous peoples whose land is being taken away in order to push forward the agenda of mining industries, are not protected. You also have in several countries, and mostly in South America, in Colombia and Ecuador, and in North America, it is very notorious in Mexico, organized crime that will also put pressure on the judiciary and will threaten prosecutors and judges in order to force them to decide what is not supposed to be decided in given cases. You have also public opinion pressure, I'm sorry. You, of course, are aware that in most countries throughout the world, cases are decided in Twitter before they are decided in courtrooms. And once the public opinion has decided a given case, of course, the judiciary is not able to take a different decision because they will look bad. And at the end of the day, they are all political actors as well. They want to run for office eventually in a different branch, or they want to have their mandates ratified and not terminated. So they act according to the pressures of the public opinion. This has been a big problem in my country regarding questions of migration, because our society discriminates a lot on the basis of national origin, and the public opinion mostly goes for, trying to deport foreign nationals and trying to avoid them being in the country or entering the country. So the pressure of the public opinion has ended up in the judges taking decisions that imply not protecting their rights. And the main issue in most countries in Latin America is the question of corruption in general, and in particular judicial corruption. And most countries in Latin America are actually now engaged in efforts that attempt to end corruption. At least that's what they say. But in practice, it is very hard once you have economical power, or you have media power, or you have organized crime power, to get the judges to decide independently and not being pressured. So this is the current situation. What will happen in both Ecuador with this transitional process and Colombia with the future of the special jurisdiction for peace, I think, is that the results that we are expecting will be limited due to the lack of judicial independence, precisely. In Ecuador, the opportunity was very good in order to finally set up a culture of judicial independence. But once someone decided to voice out the possibility of judicial independence, meaning the minority of the Council of the Judiciary, which I was part of, our boss, the Citizens Participation Council, decided that we were too loud and that we were not supposed to push forward that idea. So they decided to change us. And in Colombia, the current political situation might end up altering the effect of the special jurisdiction for peace, and with that, modifying the effect that Colombians were looking for with the peace agreements, because the special jurisdiction for peace is a consequence of the peace agreements signed in 2017. And it is clear that, for instance, the idea of different treatment that President Duque wants to apply with the special jurisdiction in order to avoid members of the military and the public force being judged by the special jurisdiction and instead creating a parallel tribunal could mean that judicial independence is not ensured for that tribunal either. That privileged treatment that members of the military who committed crimes against humanity, grave, gross violations of human rights, crimes of war, would imply that tribunal would not be independent. It would not be fair. The possibility of curtailing the powers of the special jurisdiction for peace to investigate by means of passing this constitutional amendment in order to avoid them accessing information in the hands of public authorities would also affect the judicial independence, because that's an indirect external pressure, right? Do not investigate these matters. So I am sorry that I am being so pessimistic at the end of this brief presentation. I do believe that it is important to insist in the idea of judicial independence throughout the world, in particular in our region, which is affected by so many different problems, from economical to political problems. And if we are silent, if we do not insist, then we will not manage to eventually have an independent judiciary. So I have decided to include this final idea and this final image. This is a phrase by an Uruguayan civil procedure professor, very well known. We learn procedural law with his books, both David and I. So he says that in a given country and at a given historical moment, the law is only worth what judges are worth as men. And this is true. The change to this culture of judicial independence starts with the judges. They have to decide to be independent in order to resist external pressure and in order to resist internal constraints. If the judges are afraid of what will happen to them once they have decided the cases, we will never have an independent judiciary. And the other aspect is that you have to be very public about how people try to affect judicial independence. This image appeared on a national newspaper in Ecuador. It's a cartoon from a national newspaper in Ecuador on August 9, 2018. So that's me, you can tell by my ears, right? Trying to convince a fellow council member not to put his hands into the judicial system, trying to push him back in order to manage to get his hands off the judicial system. The reason why this image appeared as a cartoon in a national newspaper was because, as I mentioned, since we failed in trying to decide behind closed doors on judicial independence in Ecuador, we had to go to the media. And what we did is that we started showing the population what this particular guy was doing. He was sending letters in specific cases to the judges, requesting explanations and giving instructions. He was a member of the Council of the Judiciary. Of course, he was allowed by law to supervise the activity of judges. Supervise the activity does not imply impose a given idea on how to decide a case, right? So the only important thing that I learned through the months that I was member of the Council of the Judiciary in my country is that you have to denounce. And in order to make sure that the population is aware of what is going on, of course, that obligation to tell what is going on is not only an obligation of the citizens who use the judicial system, but is mostly an obligation of public servants themselves. Eventually, if we manage to gather enough people who's willing to denounce, we will get to a point where the conditions for judicial independence are set, and we eventually will have an independent judiciary in my country and in other Latin American countries. So thank you very much. And of course, I am open to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll go ahead.
So I'm just curious, thank you for a quick contextual question, and that has to do a little bit, but I know you don't want to talk too much about your own view of being chosen, right? But so this committee of 5 that you're on,
that I was on.
okay, so the new president, let's call him center left turn liberal,
yeah.
or left turn liberal.
Yeah.
In a kind of free market way. So what is the context of the right wing having control of this new body? How did that happen with the new administration? That is not overtly if it is anti-Correa.
We were discussing this before we started this brief conversation. And I was mentioning that the support for President Moreno when he started was at 28%. The only reason why he managed to get into office was because he was backed by President Correa, who was very popular at the time. But even those who voted for him did not trust him. And right now, it is at 26%. This means that even though he is a left-wing guy turned liberal, kind of, in order to stay in office, due to our constitutional design that provides for eventually terminating his mandate through something we call cross death, muerte cruzada. So the only way in which he will stay in office is by reaching agreements with other political tendencies, and in particular with the right, which is very strong right now, precisely because of Correa. In Ecuador, most people is not fond of the left and its ideologies due to what Correa did, and he was actually not a left-wing guy at all, not at all. But the left is in very bad shape right now. So Moreno has made agreements with the right, and part of those agreements were having a council of the judiciary that would be a right-wing council of the judiciary. They actually wanted the 5 seats, and Moreno managed to include me. I was actually presented to the Citizens Participation Council for the election by the executive branch, and the social movements, specifically the workers' organizations, managed to include Angelica. But still, they had the right had the majority in the council.
I have a question. What are your thoughts regarding lawfare and the white coup d'etat spread over Latin America? Don't you see a pattern of behavior over the countries, whereas the Latin American countries are enforcing corruption according to the international treaties? The most powerful country in the continent doesn't ratify many of the international treaties, and they're spreading this rule of law according to their vision. And what is, in this regard, independence of the judiciary when we are bounded somehow by ideas that are not in our behalf of our sovereignty as Latin American countries?
This idea of lawfare agenda being pushed forward has come to Ecuador as well, because, as I mentioned, Vice President Glass is in jail now, and former President Correa is being prosecuted for kidnapping, not for corruption, which is odd, because I thought, and probably you as well, that he was going to be prosecuted for corruption, in particular for receiving money from Odebrecht and so on, but not. He's being prosecuted for kidnapping. And this is the main defense argument, that the judicial system is being used in order to politically persecute former leaders of the left. And in the particular situation of Ecuador, that I can talk about because I am Ecuadorian and I am aware of what is going on right now, I do not think this is true. The judicial system is not being used as a persecution instrument, although it was used by Mr. Correa in the past as a political persecution instrument. However, it is not independent either. So the problem is that although the executive branch is not trying to influence the decisions of the judiciary in Ecuador, political parties are trying to influence the decisions of the judiciary in Ecuador. Political parties that are currently not in power but do want to win the next presidential election. And this translates into judges being afraid of what they decide, because they know that once these political parties are in power in a couple of years, their mandates in office will be terminated unless they decide in a fashion that is condescending, at least, with the ideas of these political parties. In this particular context of judges being afraid of deciding their cases on their own and expecting not exactly an instruction, but how the political variations go every week back and forth in order to decide what the political terrain at the time is and how the case should be decided, of course, could affect due process. Of course, could affect due process. Most of the population is very resentful of what Mr. Correa had done to the country. So the population is also, you might recall that in my previous slide, I included as a factor of the lack of judicial independence, the pressure of the public opinion. And most of the population in Ecuador is actually pushing forward the idea of not having the process at all for these guys and just sending them to jail. Fast track, right? And although the prosecutors and the judges are not accepting this idea, of course, this pressure has a consequence on how they present the case and their arguments. And this also affects due process. So I'm not really sure that there's a lawfare political agenda, at least in Ecuador. But I'm aware that the conditions for a completely impartial trial are not in place right now for people who were part of the previous administration. So they will have a trial. Fair? I'm not really sure. I can tell for sure that the executive branch will not decide the cases and that the judiciary will decide the cases. But how the judiciary will decide the cases due to the political variations, it is uncertain at this point. When you come to think about how the case of Vice President Glass was managed and how he managed to get a short term in prison as a sentence, then maybe the system is not that unfair with him, because although he was prosecuted and although he was accused of corruption and so on, he could have gone to prison for an even longer term. So, yeah.
Just one other quick thing.
Yeah.
Did he offer testimony for a reduced sentence?
No, he didn't want to, and those who are cooperating with investigations are still being prosecuted. Of course, they are offered shorter terms in prison, but they are still being prosecuted.
Can I just ask in thinking about the philosophy of judicial independence, I mean, this goes back to, the classic foundations of democratic theory, and, Montesquieu and Madison in particular. Madison, those guys, they were writing before the rise of modern political parties.
Yeah.
So when they were writing, if you had an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, you would have three separate branches of government. With the rise of modern parties, and in particular the kinds of ideological polarization you see today in a place like the United States, what you see then is how difficult it is to have a judiciary that is truly independent. So that even if if Trump were to appoint, to get a nomination through, and that even if they don't interfere with what the judiciary does, they know, given the ideological grounding and using the Federalist societies, you can work through civic organizations in the United States, and you know exactly what ideological position a judge is going to take, and where they're going to fit within the court. And so, how do we, in some ways, how can the court be independent if it's going to be so heavily politicized, whether it's parties or ideology? But ultimately, that's what it seems to me is really undercutting the whole notion of the independence of the judiciary, which in the United States is very dramatic, because it's not that long ago we thought of the Supreme Court as being above partisan politics, and now it is arguably the most politicized institution in the American democratic regime.
In my opinion, it really depends on how you select judges, and I think that the U.S. system is not the best system to appoint judges to high courts. To high courts, you should appoint people who actually complies with requirements that go beyond being sympathetic to a political ideology. And the selection process should entail, in my opinion, an analysis of the ethical conduct that the person had before, of the knowledge of this person, in order to comply with the specific duties of being a member of a high court, and also on its non-affiliation whatsoever with political ideologies or parties. Of course, that's impossible anywhere, but I think that's how high courts should be selected. Yeah. So the U.S. model is not in my opinion, is not the best model. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were part of external or international entity supervising the functioning of the
Special jurisdiction
in Colombia, and that you were not sure about what role you were finally going to play.
None of us is.
But I was wondering if you think that there is still some room for international pressure to be put on the Colombian government to make it comply at least with the most important points of the peace accord, and because the government already passed or proposed a major reform of the judiciary in general, and they want to merge all the courts.
Yeah.
And people are very afraid that this is going to lead to basically a dictatorship, because the Uribe's party is in control of Congress, is in control of the executive, and now that would mean to be in control of the judiciary.
Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with the structure of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, it is a consequence of the peace agreements. And in the original idea of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, it was supposed to be a hybrid tribunal. So national judges were supposed to be sitting next to international judges. And there's where we come in. We are what is left of those international judges of the special jurisdiction for peace that were changed first to foreign experts that would participate in the discussions but would not vote in the decisions of the court, to what we are now, the amici curiae, the amicus curiae. We are no longer judges, that's clear, we are experts, but we cannot participate in the discussions of the special jurisdiction. We can only issue opinions, and the special jurisdiction is not, of course, obliged to follow those opinions, which is good and is bad. Is bad because the possibility of a fair trial and impartial decision, I think, relied mostly on having this hybrid tribunal, and the international judges would ensure that the decisions are objective. So it's bad in that sense. It is good that we do not have clearly defined duties, because then we can issue any opinion we want once we are invited to do so, because the current rules of procedure state that the amici curiae will act only when they are invited by the special chambers or by the tribunal. Regarding the specific question, the political moment in Colombia is very bad to make sure that the special jurisdiction will keep functioning as it was supposed to function, and to make sure that the Centro Democrático does not take all branches of power. What is going on in Colombia is very similar to what we went through during the first years of the Correa mandate, meaning that slowly he was taking over all the branches of power. And the last one was the judiciary, actually. The international pressure, indeed, I think, is the main factor to make sure that not only the special jurisdiction, but the division of powers in Colombia is maintained. And I think that the international community in this sense is somehow complying with its role. Somehow, because, of course, a lot of additional pressure could be put on making sure that the peace agreements are complied with and the special jurisdiction works, and so on. But the international community is not silent either. So I do believe that the only way in which you could make sure that the different branches of power in Colombia are maintained as independent is through political pressure, based on the fact that you are in a transitional process, and the success of the transitional process and of peace and reconciliation depends on having independent power, branches of power. Otherwise, you will not have a complete peace, because, of course, Uribe never wanted the peace. So if he's the one who's the head of all branches of power, including the executive, because Duque is not really the president, then if the guy in charge never wanted peace, of course, peace will fail. So the pressure of the international community is key for that.
Need to close on a pessimistic note, but I think we have come to the end of our scheduled time. But we thank you very much for very
Thank you.